on the side. There we go. All right, okay. There's a phenomenon called pareidolia, where you see faces everywhere, and everyone has this. I mean, every human's brain is programmed to look for faces and to pull out faces out of anything. And in fact, me and Janelle actually have a shared album on our phone of when we see something that looks like a face. I know, it's weird. When we see something that looks like a face, we take a picture of it and we add it to the shared album. And we've got quite a collection. You see it at faucets, the two knobs, and then like the nose is the thing. You have to be creative sometimes, but some like this picture up here, a little bit creepy, but trees look like they have faces. And there's even some suspicion there that maybe animation, cartoons, and the like actually came from this phenomenon of pareidolia. You look at something that's not alive, an inanimate object, but it looks like something that is alive, but it's seeing faces everywhere. And we're going to look at that. We're going to bring that back into John the Baptist. So hang on to that as we go through our text, and we'll come back to this idea of pareidolia and mistaken identity. But as we get into the text here, I want to look at a sermon that you will never forget, and the people definitely never forgot, because we quote it all the time. You brood of vipers. Hopefully we don't quote it at somebody, or we're not calling someone that, but it's a pretty well-known verse within the Bible. You brood of vipers. And it was really, the viper was one of the most deadly animals around that time. And if you think about it, we're very blessed to be in the time that we're living and in the country that we're living in, with all the medical advancements that we have. If you were to be bitten by several vipers or a whole brood of vipers, then there's a good chance that we could still get what we need to make it through it. But in that day and age, if you were bitten by a viper, there was very little that could be done. If you remember when Paul is on his third missionary journey, I believe, and he's on an island, and then there's this viper that comes out of the fire, and it clings to his arm. Everyone that was there, they didn't even say, oh, well, maybe if we get him an anti-venom, if we take care of him, then he should be all right. They went ahead and just wrote him off as dead. They were like, well, the gods definitely were mad at Paul for something. He was just bitten by a viper. And in the text says, they waited for him to fall over dead. So a viper was not something that, it wasn't a compliment. It was far from a compliment, and we can even use that as an insult today. But the direction of this slight was a heavy one. At this time, there were lots of people that we might call corner preachers or street corner preachers. John the Baptist was not the first. Even though he was talked about, and we mentioned this on Sunday night, Malachi speaks of him in the closing section of the Old Testament at the very end of Genesis. Malachi speaks that before Jesus shows up, there will be a voice that's crying in the wilderness. And so John the Baptist is the answer to that prophecy. But he breaks all of the rules. All of the rules. I mean, he's a Nazirite. He wasn't the first Nazirite or one following that Nazirite vow, but he broke all the rules of a street corner preacher of the time. There were lots of teachers and rabbis that would walk around. They would gather up and then they would have their own students. So Jesus wasn't the first to do it. John the Baptist wasn't the first to do it. The difference is, though, most of those street corner preachers, they would get up and, like politicians today, they would basically just try and say the things that will gather them the most followers, therefore giving them the most influence. And so they would open up, and I got to read through several of these actually recorded lessons of these street corner preachers, or even those that were preaching paganism, and it was interesting. The pagan sermons, very similar to those religious sermons preached by the Jews or by the Christians, but they would address people and try and unify everyone by saying fellow Jews or fellow heirs to the kingdom, or they would say something like fellow citizens of Rome, to try and bring everybody together and say things that would either upset them, talking about high taxes or how unfair the government was being, a lot of things that are basically still being preached today. But they would try and gather up a following so that they would have the most amount of power. John, though, he went a completely different route, and it still worked. It may not have worked as well as some of those other preachers, but I want us to go and look at this lesson. And we read that highlighted portion right there when he calls the Pharisees a brood of vipers. But I want to go from the lead-in, from how he starts off this lesson, and then look at what he decided to go with for his first sermon to the world, his first introduction. It was definitely a voice crying in the wilderness, and it came out of nowhere. At least that's what it seemed to everybody else. So chapter 3 opens up with the day and age, the time, those that were in leadership. This is very important to establish this as an historical account. because you can check it. You can check the leaders at this day and age and line them up and get a pretty good idea of the time period that John was preaching in. So Luke doesn't shy away from any of those kinds of details. Like, don't fact check me. Don't ask who was there, what day it was. Luke doesn't care about any of that. He gives them the points that you can go back and fact check him. So starting in verse 7, he said, therefore, to the crowds that came out to be baptized by him. All right, so here's his sermon. He's baptizing them not for the forgiveness of sins, but in order to prepare them for the teachings of Jesus. So he's baptizing them, and then he says, you brood of vipers, who warned you to flee from the wrath to come, bear fruits in keeping with repentance, and do not begin to say to yourselves, we have Abraham as our father. For I tell you, God is able from these stones to raise up children from Abraham. Even now the axe is laid to the root of the trees. Every tree, therefore, that does not bear good fruit is cut down and thrown into the fire. And the crowds asked him, what then shall we do? And he answered them, whoever has 2 tunics, or 2 cloaks, some versions might say, is to share with him who has none. And whoever has food is to do likewise. Tax collectors also came to be baptized, and they said, teacher, what shall we do? And he said to them, collect no more than you are authorized to do. And soldiers there also asked, and we, what shall we do? And he said to them, do not extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation, and be content with your wages. So we'll start with that, but this sermon, again, breaks all of the rules. He doesn't try and bind everybody together. He doesn't try and influence as many people as he possibly can. Rather, what he does is he says a lot of things that wouldn't sit well with most people at that time, including tax collectors. Tax collectors, because then you're getting into their job, and you're going to make their boss mad because their boss is Rome. And then you have Roman soldiers. Those whose first allegiance would not be Christ, or is not Christ, there is not God. They have no connection with Judaism, but even them, they're saying, is there anything that we can do, or what is it that you want us to do? And the answers that John will give them, each of them, you can see why many in the crowd turned away. What do you mean, don't extort people? I mean, there's so much corruption. This is the only way that we can scrape by. This is the only way that we can make a living, some might think, or some might say. You have tax collectors that are mingling with all of the other Jews and with all of the other people that are there. And so those Gentiles or those Jewish people that are turning and looking at tax collectors right next to them, you can almost hear them scoff when the tax collectors say, what do we do? And the Jews around them go, you can't do anything. You're a tax collector. This sermon's not for you. You're one of the brood of vipers is what they might be thinking. But there's something for them to be done. Well, there's something that can be done. But he starts off, you brood of vipers, and it doesn't seem to scare those that are willing to listen. And we'll come back to that idea in just a second. There are 3 major points that John will make from this section. Several subpoints, but 3 major points. And because I am a classic preacher, I will go with 3 points. But when he looks at the crowd and he begins to divide them from the vipers from the faithful or the potential faithful. The vipers from the ones that Jesus will be looking for in the future when he comes. And so how you can tell if someone is faithful or someone is not in it for the wrong reason is if they are bearing fruit. And here's why. So as we go down through here, it says, as people were in expectation, this is verse 15, and all were questioning in their hearts concerning John, whether he might be the Christ. And John answered them all, saying, I baptize you with water, but he who is mightier than I is coming, and the strap of whose sandals I am not worthy to untie. He will baptize you with the Holy Spirit and with fire, with his winnowing fork in his hand to clear his threshing floor, to gather the wheat into his barn, but the chaff he will burn with unquenchable fire. So as you get into what he's asking these people to do, it really doesn't it's not a classic thing that maybe a preacher or a teacher would say today. What shall we do? What's the response to the invitation, if you will? And look at it. So the first group of people that he says, the crowds ask him, what shall we do? The crowds in general, those that are there. He says, if you have 2 tunics, share with him who has none, and whoever doesn't have any food, do likewise. Bear fruit. Fruits of your conversion. Religion at this time was either watered down or it was just harsh and strict. And so there was really no room for love, which is why you might see all of these sections throughout the New Testament, entire chapters even, about the having love, how crucial it is, how important it is to have love. But really, the fruits of conversion, this is what it looks like. How can you be a Christian? How can you believe in God? How can you be a follower if you can walk past somebody who doesn't have clothes or who's naked and you just walk by and don't clothe them? How can you walk past somebody who's starving and not feed them and then claim to follow God? And so his answer to these people, very simple. It's not this complex plan that he ends up laying out. And again, this is John. This is not Jesus preaching, but this is to prepare them for Jesus. So what shall we do? Be a good person. Be giving. Give to those and have compassion on people. And really, again, Luke, since he focuses on the crowd so much, and since he focuses on the humanity here, he will talk about what it's like to be a person here. So what does it mean to be a Christian? What does it mean to follow God? We don't need to overcomplicate it. It means help others. It means be giving. Give to those that have none if you have extra. And we'll talk about that in a second too. To the tax collectors came to be baptized. What shall we do? He said, collect no more than you're authorized to do. Simply don't cheat people. Simply don't steal from people. Give to people that are in need and don't take from them. And then you have the Roman soldiers that are here. The soldiers asked, what shall we do? And he said to them, don't extort money from anyone by threats or by false accusation. Don't use your position of power to bully other people, basically, and be content with your wages. Soldiers were poor, and that's why they would end up using brute force and just the power of Rome that would back them to get what they wanted, and they would do it a lot. It was very, very common. And so when we look at what John the Baptist is doing, we might notice a couple of things here. There's nothing really about, well, you need to make sure that you go to church on Sunday morning, Sunday night. Make sure you're there on Wednesday. Make sure that you're a faithful Christian. While all of these things are an important and crucial part of being a Christian today, John is trying to prepare them for Jesus. And so what he does to prepare them for Jesus and to prepare Jesus for them is to get them to be more virtuous. 2 Peter chapter 1. Be a better person. Be a morally upstanding person. Help those that need help. Don't steal from people, and don't bully other people. It's a very simple message. And it makes a good Christian later, and it will make a good citizen then. And it will make a statement. Hey, you're a soldier. How come you're not using the power of Rome to steal like everybody else is? Hey, you're a tax collector. How come you're not charging more? How come you're not cheating us? How come you're giving us the exact amount that we're supposed to give back to Rome? And then to the Gentiles. And I take the crowds that ask him in verse 10, I take them to be the Gentiles, but there could be some Jews in here as well. But the crowds ask, what shall we do? And I think that's important because when he will get down to the tax collector and the soldier, he will start off with the generic and the crowd's thought. This was the main thinking of the crowds. But it wasn't a popular message because John comes in, guns blazing, right at the Pharisees, and we'll come back to that in just a second as well. So if you are wanting to follow Jesus, if you want to follow God, even if at the time they thought that John the Baptist might be Jesus, but if you are looking to be a follower of God, and if you're going to prepare for God to be a follower, then you've got to have a good heart. You have to have a soft heart. Of all the people that were here, and I can imagine if I put myself in their shoes, I can imagine that standing in a crowd and seeing somebody come out that's disheveled, has been living in the wilderness eating locusts and honey, and then begins preaching something so radical. And from the text, what's interesting about this sermon is unlike the Sermon on the Mount, it may not be the exact words. It could have been a little bit longer than what Jesus was preaching there. But through inspiration, it was mainly just the sub-points or the main ideas that Jesus was giving across. That's just speculation. But here it seems that the lesson of John the Baptist was recorded word for word. And so imagine standing there in the crowd, whatever category you would fall into, and you hear this radical lesson, you brood of vipers, immediately making an enemy of some of the most powerful people in your community and in your life. Our reaction to most of the time when we're confronted with something that's that dangerous or what we might describe as toxic is to remove ourselves from that situation or that person. maybe to begin dispersing as a crowd. This is not someone we want to follow. This is not someone we want to hang around with. He's going to get us in trouble. He just made enemies of the Pharisees. He called them vipers. They're not going to let that stand because they're power hungry, but they're standing there amidst all of these different people from these different walks of life, all wanting to know what it is to be done, and most curious of all, they think that John the Baptist is Jesus. And we'll come back to that point in just a second as well. But the point is, Jesus is always looking for someone. In the same book, Luke chapter 9, 57 through 62 is that section of those three that were trying to follow Jesus, and Jesus gives them those various answers, turning them away at the end of the day, or letting them know what the cost of discipleship is. But Jesus is always looking for someone in particular. There's a junkyard up on the screen here because I lately have been having a difficult time finding a drive shaft for my car. And it's a unique one. It's a long one. It's oddly shaped. And I went to the junkyard here in town, and I enjoy going to the junkyard, just piles of old car parts and tetanus everywhere. But I walked up to the counter, and I just said, I need a 57-inch drive shaft, 3.5 millimeters in diameter around. That's what I need. And they said, we don't have that here. That's really specific. That's for a very specific car, ugly car, maybe some might say. It's for a very specific car. We wouldn't have anything like that. And I looked and I saw, it seems like miles of garbage, retro garbage, lots of car parts strewn everywhere, piles of it. And I thought, how could they possibly know that they don't have one of these in this entire place? And so he said, if you want, you can go back, and there's a couple of piles of drive shafts that you can go and sift through and see if you can find one. And when he said some piles, there were 9 piles. 9 piles of old rusty drive shafts just stacked on top of each other. And so I thought, okay. And I started hiking up, and I started questioning as I'm going up, how badly do I want this drive shaft? How badly do I want this car? And bad enough. I started sifting through it, and I finally, as I was about to give up, I'm on the way down, and I see the end of what looks like a drive shaft that might fit. And I pulled it out, and I don't know how in the world, but it happened to fit. It happened to be the right size. I have not started or driven it yet, so it might still blow up. So, but they had it, and they didn't know. And even though it's rare, you have to have the specific part. You have to have that exact part if it's going to do the trick, if it's going to work. On a greater level and in a much more important sense, Jesus has always been looking for someone in particular, someone who's willing to listen, someone who's willing to follow, even if it might mean danger to themselves, like an entire group of Pharisaical leaders here. So Jesus is looking for someone. John the Baptist is letting them know, introducing them to Jesus before they physically meet Jesus. If you want to follow Jesus, the Messiah, the King that is to come, here's what he's looking for. But then something interesting happens. They think that he is the Christ. Now, I want to ask you something. When you think about Jesus, would you picture him opening up a sermon? If he walked in the back doors and he was going to preach the lesson this morning, would you expect him to get up and open up his lesson with, "You brood of vipers"? It doesn't sound, at least maybe it's just America or our society today, it's not really the image or the picture that we have of Jesus. The picture that might come to mind when we think about Jesus is Jesus sitting there with children on his lap, or healing somebody, or maybe it is that image of him up on the cross sacrificing himself for all of humanity. But after he berates the crowd these leaders and say, "You are wicked, poisonous serpents, horrible, terrible, everyone should stay away from you. God's not happy with you. You're making him mad." That's what everybody hears. And at the end of it, they go, this might be the Christ. This might be Jesus. The third person that Jesus is looking for, what John the Baptist is letting them know, is that you have to be willing to watch your neighbor or watch out for your neighbor. We had a prayer meeting. It's the first Monday of every month. And as we were sitting there, and we were passing around the notes and going through the list and making this big pile of all who are sick, all of the events that are coming up that we need to be praying about. And it's a very encouraging time. I'd like to encourage all of you who are here, if you've never been, go once, and hopefully you can just keep going every time after that, because it's so encouraging to drive away afterwards after you've prayed that long about all of these different things. But sometimes what we do is we say, I'll pray for you. We let the other person know that we're praying for them, or put them on a prayer list even. And sometimes we do pray for them, and I think that's good. I think if we say we're going to pray for someone, we should. And if you're inclined to forget like me, maybe just stop and do it right then and there. But after you pray for somebody, what we see, and not just in 2 Peter, but in every single instance that we have of a follower of Christ, they're doing something. They're working. They're combining their faith with their works. They're putting those two together, and they're living out their Christian life. The Christian life has always come with work. But notice your neighbor. What if you run into somebody who's been praying? What if you're the answer to that prayer? But what you say is, I'll pray for you. At some point, we have to be the hands. We have to be the feet. We have to be the answer to somebody else's prayer within our vicinity. And so what John the Baptist is saying is at the heart of it, even though Christianity is more than just being a moral, upstanding, good person, if you see somebody who's hurting, give to them. If you see somebody that's missing a tunic and you have another tunic, give it to them. He's not saying be a martyr. He's not saying if you are barely scraping by and you're not making it and you see somebody that doesn't have a shirt and you've only got one, well, tough luck. If he's missing one, so you better give it to him. What he's saying, though, is if you see somebody who is in need and you have the means to help them out. And that's basically the same message that he gives to the other three as well. Jesus is looking for somebody in particular. They think that he looks like the Christ. And I want to show something here, because one of the main applications that we pull out of this section usually, and I think that the application is still there, but sometimes we'll look at this section and we'll see, look what John did. As soon as the people that were there and that were listening, they said, you're the Christ, you're Jesus. And John immediately turns them away and says, no, I'm not Jesus. No, he's coming after me, and I'm not even fit to tie his sandals. That's how important he is. And so we take away from that the application of, we're not Jesus, and we need to remember that we're not Jesus. I don't think that I'm preaching to anybody, I should say with anybody here this morning that thinks that they're Jesus or thinks that they might be accused of being Jesus. So what application in the text is there for us? If you look at the life of Jesus after this and the way that Luke will unravel the story of Christ, you have the genealogy, but if you notice in chapter 4, just look at how the rest of this chapter lines out. We're not going to read the whole thing, but it begins with the temptation of Jesus. And so you have Jesus in the desert. That's how he enters into his ministry. 40 days and nights without food. Goes through these different challenges, these different temptations that the devil has to dish out. And then right after that, he begins his ministry in verse 14. Jesus returned in power to the Spirit of Galilee to report about him, and a report about him went out through the surrounding country, and he taught in their synagogues being glorified by all. But then you have in verse 16, you have one verse. Now I know that there's no verses in the original, but you have one verse where you have him teaching and then being glorified by all. That one verse, and then right after his temptations, then he's rejected by his own countrymen in Nazareth. He's removed out of the place where he grew up. After that, so we have the temptation like we've never faced today. You have him being rejected by those in his hometown. And then you have, in 31 down, him healing somebody with an unclean demon. And then after this, you have, my header, I like the header in this case. In verse 38, it says, Jesus heals many. What John the Baptist was telling people to do, basically what he was saying is, look like Jesus, act like Jesus, walk like Jesus. Everything that we see here in Jesus' life, it goes from temptation, overcoming temptation, and then being rejected, and then it's just constantly serving. And that's what Luke will focus on. Look at how Jesus served these people. Look at how Jesus healed this person. Look at the lives that he changed. Look at all of the people who put away these terrible pasts and then became these powerhouses for God. Look at these great Christians that came about, and look at Peter. Look at the writer of the book. Jesus was someone that served. He's the King of Kings, but he doesn't act like a king. He doesn't act like any king that Israel ever had, not even David, better than him. He doesn't act like any government official that we have today. nobody in power. He doesn't point and tell people what to do. He asks them to at least try and do a little bit of what he's already done for us. The main lesson that we have here is not, if someone accuses you of being Jesus, you should immediately tell them that you're not. The main application here is, do people even see Jesus in us? Do people not mistake maybe us for Jesus, but do they see the power and the impact of Jesus on our life? Do they wonder why we act the way that we act, why we do the things that we do, why we give up an entire Sunday and instead of sleeping in, we come and we praise and we worship him? Do people question that? Can they even tell? That's the application for us. Look like Jesus. And sometimes that can be as simple as going out of your way for somebody else. When you see somebody who's hurting, when you see somebody who's broken down on the side of the road, and ouch, that one hurt because I passed a truck that was broken down this morning on the way here. There was no one in it, but it was broken down. But that's what it means. It means to be compassionate. It means to love people. Just a fraction of what Jesus, the love that Jesus has for us. Jesus came to give and he came to serve. But you can't enjoy any of those blessings. You can't enjoy being a member of God's family if you're not baptized into Christ. It's not just about baptism, and it's not just about being drenched in water and then, if you're not prepared for it this morning, going home a little bit wet. It's not about that. But it's about letting that faith turn into works. It's about marrying those two, taking that step even if you're afraid, and then doing it for Jesus. When you look at what Jesus has done, as soon as he started his ministry, he was always looking for the next person to help, the next person to save, the next person to heal. Is he looking for you this morning? If you don't look like Jesus, and you would like to, maybe it's because you've turned away and you've been walking in darkness, or something that you're struggling with, you've slipped up somehow, we can pray for you, we can help you, and we can all try and help each other look more like Jesus every day. If there's something that we can do for you as a church family, then why not come? As together we stand.
Zion's call sweetly rings over land and sea.